About a month ago, news broke that UK bank bosses are planning to develop DeliveryCo, an alternative to Visa and MasterCard. As one of America's closest allies, Britain is unsurprisingly late to a party that many others have started years ago. Europe's new cross-continent payment system, WERO, has already launched to 47 million users and has announced expansion plans for 130 million more. Brazil's self-developed PIG system became the default way to pay in the country 5 years after its launch and has proven so successful that Trump has recently threatened to retaliate against it. In India, UPI and RuPay have transformed the payment scene completely, as I've shown in my last video on this channel. In Russia, Mir rolled out as the national card payment standard in 2015 after Visa and MasterCard cut off the country due to sanctions following their first invasion of Ukraine. And unsurprisingly, China had one of the longest histories with American alternatives such as WeChat Pay, Alipay, and also their own card payment system called UnionPay. There are many other payment systems as well, and by now it's pretty clear that almost all major economies around the world are actively looking to reduce their reliance on the likes of Visa and MasterCard. This push is really gaining steam now, with many alternatives even starting to go beyond national borders, and yet both Visa and MasterCard keep reporting solid revenue growth and even record profits, with Visa, for example, having made $40 billion in revenue and an incredible $20 billion in profit just last year. So in this video, let's take a look at how the search for alternatives is going and how the big two are pushing back. This video was sponsored by Hansen Shaving. During the 2014 Chinese New Year celebrations, 12 years ago, the Chinese social media giant WeChat launched their digital red packets. Modeled after the traditional red paper packets filled with cash that Chinese people gift to each other during the festival, WeChat allowed people to send digital envelopes to each other, including to group chats. The faster one opened one of these digital red packets in a group chat, typically the bigger share of the wallet they got for themselves, and that opened up a frenzy across the country. Red packets and WeChat Pay were an incredible success, and they started a trend that meant that by 2016, more than 420 million WeChat users sent a total of 32 billion red envelopes to each other. In just 2 years, WeChat Pay became the default payment method in the country. Jack Ma, the famous founder of Alibaba, called the red packet innovation his firm's Pearl Harbor moment. It was an existential danger. He needed to establish his competitor Alipay as a viable alternative before WeChat fully took over the market. As the operator of China's biggest e-commerce platform, he launched a relentless campaign to push online shoppers to pay with Alipay when shopping on his sites, and this worked. Within a few years, Chinese digital payments had become a two-horse race, reaching more than 1 billion users. China's traditional banking sector consisted of state-run banks who were very slow to adapt and easily outmaneuvered. Most people still didn't have credit cards in the country, so there was no digital payment system to replace, and mobile payments were simply better suited for a market that mostly lived on their phone anyway. While affluent customers, and especially those traveling abroad a lot, still have foreign cards these days, these two wallets have gobbled up almost all of the country's domestic day-to-day transactions. In this way, China became the first major market to simply skip the American card reliance. Not by careful statewide planning, but by nimble startups simply outmaneuvering the incumbents. And while this was largely seen as a positive thing by the country's leadership, the specific setup that they created for themselves wasn't seen as something very positive. See, while recent regulations have changed this a bit by now, both of these wallets were originally black box walled gardens run by private companies. An Alipay user could only pay another Alipay user, for example. The two firms were fiercely anti-competitive, leading to multiple government crackdowns on them eventually, but especially in the early days, they were most definitely not banks, and so they didn't follow traditional stringent financial regulations either. Remember Jack Ma's disappearance a few years ago? That happened after he essentially told the country's financial regulators that they should just get out of the hair of innovators like himself and just leave him be. Needless to say, the Chinese government did not like that at all. They pushed through various reforms, forcing the platforms to open up and to play more fairly, and they also rolled out the digital yuan, the government's own mobile wallet operated directly by the central bank. That one hasn't been a huge success, but either way, China was one of the first countries to successfully transition to its own payment system and to cut out the likes of Visa and MasterCard almost completely. Now, some countries saw both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Chinese system, they learned from it, and they created systems of their own that were in many ways even better. India's UPI, or Universal Payment Interface, looks a lot like Chinese wallets on the surface, which it was clearly modeled after. The focus is on mobile payments and QR codes, though the system has evolved to include just about any transaction type. I talked about my experience with it and Indian tech in general in my previous video, but the biggest innovation here is that UPI was built as a government-mandated standard from the start. It was built in 2016 by the National Payments Corporation of India, an Indian government sector company, and its innovation is that they built a sleek, unified UI on top of the country's standard banking system instead of replacing it. A customer opens a bank account and then they get an easy-to-remember UPI ID like phone number at bankname.in, or alternatively also a QR code just to make things convenient. And yes, that looks suspiciously like an email address. It's possible to open as many accounts with as many banks as one wants, and transfers between banks work by just using that ID or the QR code. No need for hard-to-remember strings like IBANs or card numbers, and UPI is not a specific app. Instead, it's built into every other app that you would normally pay with. In the background, the whole system just uses India's standard immediate payment service, which are the standard government-mandated instant bank-to-bank transfers, similar to what we call a SEPA transaction in Europe, for example. Also, all payment institutions are properly licensed and regulated just like any financial institution would be, and so instead of the anti-competitive Chinese dynamic, India has dozens of UPI service providers who actually have to compete to win. In other words, UPI is as easy to use and sleek as the Chinese wallets, but it's completely standardized and regulated. It's kind of the best of both worlds. Unsurprisingly, UPI, which is of course also free to use for most people, has taken over the whole country to the point where Google Pay in India is now also pretty much just a UPI app, not a card app like in the rest of the world. Meanwhile, UPI has also become a de facto model that other countries want to emulate. Brazil's Pix is another well-known example, in part because of how successful it has been, and in part because Trump's government has specifically singled it out to be investigated. Though of course, as the Streisand effect dictates, people have only become more interested in Pix because of that. Anyway, just like UPI, Pix was developed by the government, and in this case the Central Bank of Brazil. And also similar is that Pix is not some proprietary wallet, but quote-unquote just a user-friendly UI that in the background hides regular and regulated banks and financial institutions which are moving money by making standard instant bank-to-bank transfers. But unlike in India, where participation was theoretically voluntary, in Brazil every financial institution with more than 500,000 active accounts became a mandatory participant of Pix after it rolled out in 2020. If I had to guess, I would say that this was done because Pix rolled out later than UPI, and by that point Brazil already started using other digital payment solutions, and so Pix needed a little bit more of a push. Anyway, what's cool is that Pix users can use any alias they want, so there's no need for giving out your phone number to people that you want to have money from, and transactions are generally instantaneous. The transaction cost is free for individuals and 0.33% for businesses and merchants, and that compares to well over 1 and 2% for credit cards, so just like UPI, this too undercuts card companies significantly. Unsurprisingly, adoption has been rapid, and Pix is now the dominant payment method of the country. Now, Europe's solution, and I think you will not be surprised to hear this, is both way more complicated and also way slower to roll out than those of India or Brazil, for example. There are, of course, also a bunch of entities fighting about what exactly should be built, but that said, I also think this is one of the most interesting solutions so far. Europe essentially faces two big problems. First, unlike Brazil, India, and China, which all didn't have really dominant established payment systems that they first had to unseat, Europe very much does, and credit and debit cards are already extremely common. Meanwhile, second, Europe is also a continent, not a country. While the EU does harmonize a ton of things, there's still 20+ regulatory frameworks and central banks, plus many countries have already successfully rolled out instant payment platforms of their own many years ago. There's Ideal in the Netherlands, Vips in Nordic countries, Blik in Poland, etc., and many of these are very well used. So how does Europe build a continent-wide winning solution? Well, there's actually two different projects that are competing with each other. First is the digital euro. This is essentially the European Central Bank saying that they want to directly build and control a single payment app for people across the Eurozone. People would open an account there and directly have some of their money with the ECB, and when they made transactions, those would just go from one account to the next for free and instantly. Now, not only is this just extremely ambitious, it's also something that banks really hate, because you'd not just be replacing the likes of Visa and MasterCard, but essentially also your local national banks. So the banks themselves have been rushing to build their own payment platform that they call the European Payment Initiative instead, with which they're trying to beat the central bank to the punch. This uses WERO as their consumer-facing brand, which is what you might have already heard of, and it's kind of a wild construct. To start with, the European Payment Initiative, EPI, is a private company that is headquartered in Belgium, and its shareholders are a consortium of 16 massive European private banks and financial institutions like Germany's Deutsche Bank, France's BNP Paribas, the Netherlands' ING, and so on. These institutions have come together to develop a system similar to UPI or PIX. And like those, WERO is essentially just a very easy-to-use UI on top of the standard SEPA system, which is Europe's own instant and free bank transfer standard that has become mandatory across the continent recently. A customer can open their bank app and use that to send money to any other WERO user using their phone number, email, or QR code, similar to India and Brazil. But WERO's big challenge is adoption. Sure, the 16 founding members are pushing it into their apps, and this is where most of the 47 million claimed users come from. Deutsche Bank and ING can just turn the feature on for their users and claim that they have a user. But there's no government forcing adoption like there was in Brazil, for example, and of course Europe is saturated with existing payment methods. So how is adoption going? Well, they just started, and there's a user-made site called werotracker.eu where you can see the progress of adoption if you want to dig deeper. At the time of writing, the first 3 countries have started the rollout, including Belgium, France, and Germany. Now 50 of 106 banks that this site tracks have added support for it in their apps, and 28 more have announced that they'll add them soon too. The site also shows 28 unsupported banks, but there are hundreds more that just aren't tracked either. Some of the supporters include traditional banks like Postbank, but also many neobanks like Revolut. In fact, Maya and I set up our accounts to see what it's like, and yeah, it works exactly as you'd imagine. You can make an instant transaction in euros to anyone who set up a WERO account as well, just by searching for their phone number and email or by scanning a QR code, and it's all free. Also, if you give your bank app access to your contacts, which I did here for science, you can see all the people from your contacts who have WERO enabled, even if they don't use your bank. I seem to have 10 contacts on WERO right now. And fun fact, both Maya and I even got a €5 gift from EPI for our first transaction. Nice. For now, WERO is primarily a simple person-to-person service, but it's planned to build out merchant services, offline payments, and all later on. As the WERO tracker shows, this is in a very limited state for now, though. There are a few brands like Eventim who have already rolled out support, and a bunch of others like Air France have announced it for the future, but not much more. In other words, WERO for now is very basic, but it works, and the question is whether they can get enough adoption. To speed things up, they bought Ideal and Payconic, the leading payment platforms in the Netherlands and Belgium, to merge their users and their tech into the platform. Meanwhile, even more important is that they announced that they'll make their system interoperable with the existing national payment systems in 13 countries. These include Vipps, Blik, and more, so WERO users should be able to send and receive money to and from those seamlessly. And those all represent another 130 million users across 13 countries. How smooth will the interoperability be? Will users and merchants actually adopt WERO? We all don't know, but I guess there's at least a plan, or if I'm being exact, there are 2 plans, because there's also the digital euro, of course. Anyway, there are many more payment platforms trying to rival Visa and MasterCard, and I won't go through all of them, but it's clear that every major economy is racing to establish their own to replace the American platforms, and some are seeing real success. Now, given all of the information that I've just given, you might expect that Visa and MasterCard would start to struggle, especially outside of the US, right? That's certainly what I expected to see based on all the articles and hot takes that I've seen on the internet. But then I actually looked at their finances and found quite the opposite. Not only are they doing better than ever, with both showing healthy year-on-year gains and incredible profits, but surprisingly enough, their non-US business is actually growing consistently faster as well. For MasterCard, it's around 12% versus 5%, for example. That's not at all what I expected to see, but as it turns out, there are 4 main reasons for this. First, while the US is almost completely saturated with digital payments already, a lot of the rest of the world is massively adopting them right now. A rising tide lifts all boats, and it's possible for Visa and MasterCard to grow even when their competitors grow as well. Second, if you look at the data, it's actually XB or cross-border payments that are growing the fastest, and at 18 to 21% year-on-year, especially what they call cross-border card-not-present X-travel. That is code for basically cross-border online purchases, so say when a German person buys a video game on Steam, or when a user in South Korea pays for a subscription to Netflix. These cross-border online purchases are growing much faster than the rest of the economy, and these are exceptionally well suited to Visa and MasterCard, which are accepted almost anywhere in the world. Third, the 2 giants have also continuously raised their fees and invented new ones over the years, to the point where they were even sued successfully by merchants. They just extract more per transaction now than they did before. And fourth, Visa and MasterCard have long become much more than just card companies. They offer anti-money laundering checks, fraud prevention, tokenization, foreign exchange, acquiring and issuing services, dispute resolution, etc., which ironically, many institutions and companies, even in networks like Pix, WERO and EPI, use and pay for anyway. In other words, Visa and MasterCard often profit even if you don't use them directly. In other words, these factors mean that the big two are highly unlikely to be completely replaced anytime soon. Now, that doesn't mean that these two companies wouldn't have controlled an even larger share of the payment ecosystem if all these new competitors haven't been brought to market, and so I think that the new competitors actually still make a difference. Meanwhile, the next big step of many of these local systems is that of internationalization. After all, being stuck in their own countries or regions is one of their biggest weaknesses versus Visa and MasterCard. So UPI, for example, is expanding abroad, especially to countries that have a strong Indian diaspora. There are plans to interlink Pix with the various payment systems across Latin America, and while I haven't talked about ASEAN countries a lot in this video, they're actively in the process of making their national wallets interoperable with each other right now as well. It's the obvious next step, and we'll see how far they can go. Funnily enough, I've just seen this near a payment terminal in an Adidas store in Berlin, which accepted pretty much any payment system under the sun, and while systems like these are only really present in places that are frequented by tourists for now, it might give us a good idea of what the future could look like. A future where once local systems just start to work internationally as well. Now, payment companies are not the only ones who are overcharging you for a solution that is potentially worse than the alternative. Modern razors have become expensive, over-bloated plastic monstrosities with 3, 4, or 5 blades, moisturizing strips, and complex cartridges when none of these actually make them better. Meanwhile, my sponsor Hansen figured out that the good old safety razor actually outperformed these modern products as long as you introduced one major change to it: precision manufacturing. The more precisely and evenly the blade is held in place, the less chatter there is, meaning less wobbling and bending, and the better the blade can be kept at exactly the right angle. And all of this leads to a cleaner shave and to avoiding irritation and razor burn. Hansen says that their aerospace machine shop in Canada has also made parts for a Mars rover and the International Space Station, so they certainly know how to do a precise job, and with their razor they managed to get their tolerances down so that their blades only extend by 0.0013 inches past the shave plane according to them. That is less than the thickness of a single human hair, and the construction also keeps it uniformly there so it's always perfectly parallel. I've been shaving my neck area under my chin with a Hansen safety razor for about a year now, and it's been a really nice experience. Just a few quick swipes with very minimal pressure, and I have a perfectly clean shave. There's of course also much less waste than there is with cartridges, which is good for the environment, and while the handle itself is of course a bit of an investment, the blades themselves only cost about 10 cents each instead of the $2 or so that you'd pay for a cartridge. This means that over time you'll easily save money, and Hansen doesn't even have a subscription because you just won't need one. And to go further, Hansen will even give buyers their first 100 blades for free if they use my link hansenshaving.com/TechAltar. To do this, you'll need to put both the razor and the blades in your cart. So go to hansenshaving.com/TechAltar and enter the code TechAltar for 100 blades for free. Add both products to your cart. Happy shaving, and I'll see you in the next video.